Yamini Zanawi in Moscow. This week, Russia. Love it or hate it? The motherland leave few indifferent. Maria Zakharova, spokesperson for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is in the now. Today, Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson for Russia's Foreign Affairs Ministry, is with us. Thanks so much for coming in. Syria, the migrant crisis, the rise of far-right sentiment in Europe, things right now don't look so good on the continent. Why has this become possible?
Generally speaking, I think maybe the Maya were right with their calendar after all. The seismic shifts we observe today in international relations and the world situation in general are not limited to one region or one continent. It is a global change, a redistribution of forces, a shift in the balance of power worldwide. At least everything points in this direction. And things are only getting worse. It all started with certain countries, and we all know what those countries are. We can openly name those countries now. It all started when they decided to revise the fundamental principles of international relations and interaction between nations. They sought to downplay and completely destroy such principles as mutual respect between nations, territorial integrity, and respect of other countries' sovereignty, non-interference in other countries' affairs. These are the fundamental principles enshrined in the UN Charter, which used to guarantee the peaceful coexistence of nations, and they are in jeopardy today. So the things happening today, like the situation with migrants, or to call a spade, refugees, we're basically witnessing an exodus from the Middle East. The situation in the Middle East and the upsurge in terrorism, these are all harbingers of things to come, showing us that without a proper system of international law, this is what the world may eventually come to. Of course, I don't mean to sound ominous, but, like I said, these are just the early signs of things to come.
The U.S. is very open about Russia being one of the major threats to it in the world. Just take a listen to this.
Standing up to Russian aggression.
Russia presents the greatest threat to our national security.
Considered Russia the #1 threat to the United States.
So the U.S. doesn't hide that it believes Russia is an enemy. Maybe some diplomats slightly.
No, this is not the way it is. You're saying the U.S. makes no secret of the fact that Russia is the biggest threat, and so on and so forth. I strongly disagree with this. To make no secret of something means you honestly believe this. You have all the facts, and eventually you start telling the world the truth. Our situation is totally different. They certainly know that we pose no threat. They certainly have no facts to show that we pose some kind of threat. They just want to create an impression that they perceive Russia as a threat. This is something totally different. If the United States had at least some facts, if they had at least something, they would have presented it to the world a long time ago. But they have no facts. They have nothing that would look at least remotely like facts. All we've seen so far is a typical propaganda campaign, which makes use of all the tools available to them. Government agencies, prominent newsmakers, major media organizations. They all form a kind of a holding company, a propaganda conglomerate. In fact, they went further. A local campaign is not enough for them. They want to go global. This is why they do the things they do, say the things they say. They use international media as an orchestra, where every media organization, even a small one, has a role to play. The BBC makes films about Russia launching a nuclear attack against Baltic nations. The Litvinenko case resurfaces in the UK, almost implicating the Russian leadership in this poisoning. From time to time, reports blaming Russia for the MH17 crash appear in the media, and so on and so forth.
It's a lot of words, a lot of rhetoric is what you're saying. I want to have you listen to this, because I think some would argue that it is just words, and a lot of the fault is in the media. I'm a huge media critic myself, but listen to some of what some of the words of the Russian media, what they have to say about the U.S.
Через 4 года США смогут безнаказанно нанести ядерный удар по России.
Да и Россия – единственная страна в мире, которая реально способна превратить США в радиоактивный пепел.
Вы можете мне рассказывать, что Соединенные Штаты и НАТО в целом – это миротворец. А для меня это новый Третий Рейх.
Isn't this rhetoric and words as well? And is it a way to answer propaganda of CNN and BBC?
I would agree with you if you could show me a single statement by the Russian Foreign Ministry that contains a billionth part of the rhetoric we hear from the State Department and the White House.
We're talking about the media here, though, because you brought up propaganda and the BBC.
You know, propaganda always involves both the government and the media.
Okay, so where is Kisilyov and some of the propaganda and the very strong statements we're hearing in the Russian media coming from, if it's not a tone they're taking from the government?
First of all, you have to ask Kisilyov about this. He doesn't take orders from me when making his show. In fact, we understand the concerns of our counterparts in the US and other countries who sent official requests to us, asking us to influence Kisilyov and others. We tell them that we have a free media and we don't share their extreme views. We always stress this in our media events. But there's nothing we can do if some people in Russia listen to Mr. Breedlove or Mr. McCain or other US government officials, and the things they say evoke such a belligerent response in some of the Russian people. This is their reaction to the things they hear. You may remember that there was a period 10 or 15 or perhaps even close to 20 years during which we would listen to everything the West had to say with our eyes and ears wide open, and we did our best to cooperate with our Western partners. In fact, we're still trying to cooperate with them. But when Mr. McCain starts talking about Russia the way he does, and Western media outlets make films about Russia launching nuclear strikes against Europe, and NATO officials like Stoltenberg or his predecessor announce that they are going to boost their defense spending to contain Russia, what kind of reaction do you expect from some of the people of Russia? Unfortunately, this comes as a response to the things we hear from the West.
You suggested that there's no kind of evidence or proof that you could directly affect the media and what they do, their tone. Are you suggesting that there is this kind of connection between the State Department and the media we see on CNN and BBC? Is there a direct, so to say, push from the government in the U.S. media?
We know that the media tends to focus on what you might call bad news. Few journalists are interested in covering only positive news. The media is mostly interested in terrorist attacks and humanitarian disasters. And there's nothing wrong with that, because that's where people are suffering, and that's what the media should focus on. But sometimes the media employs double standards. Sometimes, for example, the media sees the humanitarian crisis in Aleppo, but ignores the humanitarian crisis in southeastern Ukraine. This can only mean one of two things. Either you are incompetent as a journalist, or there's someone behind you pulling the strings. There's no other option.
Can we easily say the same thing about Russian journalists?
Let me finish. I'm well familiar with the professional level of U.S. journalists. I've worked with them in New York and in Moscow, and I can't imagine that they can be so incompetent. It's just impossible not to notice the things they ignore.
So you're saying they're consciously deciding not to tell, let's say, both sides in Ukraine?
As far as Ukraine is concerned, I can offer you an example. You asked, what about the Russian media? I can tell you that Russian media outlets work both in Kiev and in southeastern Ukraine. The only problem is they're not allowed to work in Kiev. I think you know from your own channel's experience how hard it is to get accreditation or get a TV crew inside Ukraine. You can be deported at any moment. You know what the Ukrainian authorities said.
It's horrible. It's horrible, and we should condemn it. But my question is here.
So there you go. That's the difference between the way the Russian media works. And I'm not saying that its position on Ukraine is totally unbiased. No, you may be an extremely professional journalist, but there will always be something personal in what you write. But Russian journalists provided their audience with information both from Kiev and from the southeast. How many Western media outlets work in southeastern Ukraine? I can hardly remember any.
No, of course, but I think it's horrible. It's a mistake, and two wrongs don't make a right.
But this is not a mistake. A mistake is something you do unintentionally, but I think they know what they're doing. It's impossible not to notice what is going on. It's impossible not to notice those people who were burned alive in Odessa. I'd like to say one more thing concerning Syria. Do you think the international community and global media outlets hadn't heard about the humanitarian crisis in Syria until recently? Do you think that for 4.5 years they didn't realize that Syrian children were suffering because of the internal conflict and war that is raging there? They didn't say a word about it. Instead, they've been shipping arms, sending money, and financing the so-called moderate opposition, which was supposed to topple Assad. Nobody ever thought about the children. I believe that a Syrian boy or girl in 2014 is no different from a Syrian boy or girl in 2015. They are the same children. The only difference is that back then, the media didn't care to talk about them, and now they do.
All right, we're going to stop you on that note. It's a great point to stop. Syria, when we come back, it's In the Now with Maria Zakharova. Stay with us.
This is Boombas, and these are the stories we are tracking for you today.
I think that the euro is severely undervalued.
That's the highest output in over 3 years.
What the Fed really wants is inflation.
The U.S. has more than doubled imports from Iraq.
All that debt that was accumulated, they have to pay it off.
And when you see oil go down, our economy goes down.
What do you make of that data, and what does it really mean for the average worker?
Today, I'm directing my administration to cut through the red tape, break through the bureaucratic hurdles, and make this project a priority.
Keystone XL pipeline. Keystone XL has become a household name. But what do we know about the communities living along the proposed route?
When you look at the percentage of refineries in our area compared to the amount of people with cancer, it's got to be a link.
We're being disproportionately bombarded with the toxic waste from these facilities because we don't have a voice.
Building alliances with different organizations and communities is very important because we're spread thin throughout the area.
We went on a road trip to meet some of these communities on the front lines of resistance.
Welcome back. Today we have Maria Zakharova. She is the face, I think it's fair to say, of Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We've been speaking about Syria. This, of course, a very pressing issue for Russia, very much so at the moment. Just a couple of weeks ago, you suggested that it could be suitable to prop up armed opposition against ISIS, which, of course, Russia is doing, but that the U.S. should not do the same because their purpose is different. Could you expand on that for us?
The problem is that for about 2 years now, the Americans who led the coalition have been saying that they're fighting terrorists. Yet they continued to support certain groups within the Syrian opposition that they considered moderates. During the whole time, we, not just Russia, but the whole world, couldn't understand their strategy. The coalition's plans and objectives kept changing, making it impossible for us to understand their strategy. The number of terrorists kept growing, as did their supply of arms and money. All these factors led us to ask a question. What exactly are you doing in the region if all your stated objectives have not been met and all your actions have in fact had an opposite effect? So it's difficult to understand the U.S. strategy there, unless we admit that their intention is to destabilize the region as a whole. There are no other logical explanations.
This idea of good armed opposition, bad armed opposition. I mean, many Russian officials, including Sergei Lavrov, have said if it looks like a terrorist and it walks like a terrorist, it is a terrorist. Basically, it's hard to tell on the ground, and facts would show. So why and how can Russia now tell who's the good armed opposition?
First of all, the UN Security Council has its own list of terrorist groups. That is what we have in theory. But there's also a reality. We have the UN Security Council list of terrorist organizations, but there might be a person on the ground who doesn't have a permanent affiliation. Today, he's part of ISIL. Tomorrow, he will be a member of Jabhat al-Nusra. And then he will become disillusioned with both and establish his own group, and might later be joined by another 1,000 people. Or he himself may join some other group consisting of 1,000 members. That's why for many months now, and specifically starting in September 2015, Russia has been trying to get the same message across. Russian military, the US, the coalition and its members, as well as any other countries willing to work together, should sit down, identify terrorist groups, and join efforts in the fight against them. It has to be just military people who have the necessary information and expertise who actually run the operations. Diplomats and politicians create a certain context, but it is up to the military to actually fight against terrorists, if that in fact is the objective.
So why was Russia against arming or helping any of the opposition for so many years, and what changed?
We've been saying all along that we cannot support the opposition that fights against the regime, however good or bad this regime may be. It's just fundamentally wrong. We can only supply arms to the official government. International law clearly states that.
Right, but now Russia is bombing to support some of the rebel groups against ISIS, yes?
You say that we changed our position on this and now support some opposition groups. We support the groups that fight against terrorists, not the regime. And we have official consent from Damascus to do so. Do you understand the difference? I think that a lot of people don't understand this complex situation. They hear just one thing: Russia is bombing. Russia-Syria bombings. They don't understand that we stopped it when the terrorist threat began to spread beyond Syria, when it stopped being an internal Syrian issue or even a regional issue and became an international problem. That's when we got involved, saying that we will only be working in coordination with Damascus and upon its request. Second, we were not going to side with Damascus or the opposition, as our goal was to fight against international terrorism. Third, we said that we were open to any information exchange with any interested parties. We set up coordination centers, information coordination, whatever you prefer, in Iraq and Jordan, so that our international colleagues could feel free to exchange information. We did all that.
How can you say that Russia has not chosen a side in this conflict when they're clearly backing Assad and his army?
We're not taking sides in the internal conflict in Syria. Damascus vices the opposition. We're not taking sides. It's their business. It is unfortunate that people go to a point where they felt that they had no more political means left and resorted to using weapons. But we don't consider them terrorists, even when we're talking about armed opposition. They are terrorists with specific terrorist goals. We target those groups.
This idea of labeling terrorists, can it be dangerous in the fact that the United States will label terrorists as it sees it according to its national interests, and Russia, to protect its national interests, will do the same?
Technically, this is a possibility, but we have no time for political games. Terrorists are already among us. They're in Paris. They are in the United States. They are on Sinai. They are already everywhere. Of course, we could continue competing with each other, trying to figure out who's the coolest. I guess it is important for America. But in reality, we're running out of time, because tomorrow they will come to somebody else's house.
Let's listen to what you were talking about, how to many global citizens, the war in Syria, it's not clear. It's about Russia bombing and this person bombing, and they don't really know the details. This is what viewers of mainstream media are hearing about Russia and its bombing campaign. Take a listen.
200 civilians have been killed in Russian airstrikes in Syria.
Indiscriminately bombing a civilian area.
Russian jets are responsible for the strikes.
Dozens of civilian casualties.
Killed countless civilians.
How do you react to these accusations? I know you've answered this question before, but it's an important one.
It's the same issue. Who is communicating this kind of message? Western officials say that. The State Department, Foreign Office, French Foreign Ministry, etc. If you're an official representative of your state agencies, please give us official information that would confirm that these intentional mass killings of civilians and destruction of infrastructure took place. During this whole time, we haven't received any official data from them. No images, no numbers, nothing. There's one figure: 70–80% of Russian airstrikes hit civilian targets. They openly say that, but when we ask for proof, there's nothing. Their technical capabilities are very advanced, and yet they fail to produce satellite images and so forth. It means that they don't really have them. So it's all part of a propaganda drive that eventually makes its way into the media.
Obviously, any country that decides that it's going to take part in a bombing campaign realizes that there could be collateral damage. The U.S. makes tons of mistakes, right? Kunduz not too long ago. How is it possible to take a stance that there have been no civilian casualties during this many months of bombing? Is it even physically possible?
You're right. It's impossible to avoid collateral damage. It is a military operation, after all. Secondly, yes, there were civilian casualties because of U.S. involvement in the conflict, and also in the previous ones. And there was proof right away. Photos, statements from eyewitnesses and victims. There were specific numbers. But there's nothing of the sort in our situation. This reminds me of the reports about Russian tanks being deployed to Ukraine. They all talked about those tanks, failing to provide any picture, eyewitness accounts. I mean, credible reports, not official statements from the Kyiv authorities, who are ready to say anything, trying to end up on the right side of history. I'm talking about real facts, and nobody has that. Let me give you an example. There was one incident not so long ago when our Western colleagues said that they now have proof of our wrongdoing in Syria. So they brought a photograph to an expert meeting. And when a Russian diplomat asked to have a closer look, they refused to let the picture out of their hands. Have you ever seen anything like that?
I want to talk about acknowledgement. If there is evidence, or if the Ministry of Defense itself, comes out one day and says, look, we made a mistake, is Russia going to acknowledge its mistakes?
When did we not acknowledge our mistakes?
When people criticized Russia for being in Crimea, and they said they weren't in Crimea, and then a year later, Russia admitted that it was Russia in Crimea.
I was there from the very beginning, looking at the Crimea situation from the Foreign Ministry. And I myself, Minister Lavrov, and others kept saying that Russian military personnel were in Crimea legally because we had our naval base there. Nobody had ever denied the fact that there were Russian soldiers in Crimea. It would have been impossible. They were there as part of the bilateral agreement. We also talked about specific numbers, stating that we never exceeded the limit of military personnel stipulated in the Russian-Ukraine agreement.
Right, but according to all those laws, they were supposed to be on their bases. And obviously we had evidence of the so-called little green men across Crimea. I don't want to get too involved in Ukraine because we've spoken so much about Syria, and I want to have one last quick question about Turkey. Turkey and its murky dealings with ISIS. There are a few people who would argue with some of the evidence we've seen from Russia. Why did Russia wait so long to show that Turkey had these ties?
On the one hand, that might have been our mistake. Maybe we should have brought it up from day one. On the other hand, we proceeded from the understanding that our main objective was not to level accusations in public, but to get things done. So we engaged in the Vienna process, as well as addressed our counterparts on a bilateral basis, trying to convince them it was wrong to act the way they did. Like I said, maybe we should have done so publicly. But our reasoning was that we shouldn't generate additional tension, but rather seek to resolve the issue in question. As for Turkey's current actions at the Syrian border, they're certainly way out of line. We persistently called for the sealing of the border between Turkey and Syria at the UN Security Council. I apologize if my choice of language seems a bit blunt for a diplomat, but what's going on there is absolutely outrageous. At the time when the ISSG has just adopted its statement in Munich, and all the stakeholders have agreed on moving towards a cessation of hostilities, Turkey is shelling the residential areas over the border, sending in fighters, material and money simply because it can't get over the fact that these areas are being liberated from the extremists that Turkey has spent so much time aiding and abetting.
Okay, let's end on a lighter note. Tell us something that you think people in the West, so to say, don't know about you. They see you as the face of the foreign ministry. What is the most surprising thing about Maria Zakharova?
I don't really want to talk about myself. You can find out about me in social media, complete with photos, so anyone can see for themselves and draw their own conclusions. I can tell you this. There's a Soviet-era song that I believe to be more relevant today than ever before. It's titled, "Do the Russians Want War?" I think this is something the West does not understand about us. There are many issues where they can afford not to understand what we're trying to say, but they need to understand this. Even for modern-day Russians, who grew up at a peaceful time and didn't witness World War II, even though we did witness the war in Chechnya and we've had to face the threat of international terrorism, there's no prospect more terrifying than war. That's the way I was brought up, and that may be the biggest secret about me. My grandma used to tell me, remember, there's nothing more horrible than war. Every time I'd come to complain about something, she'd tell me, that's nothing, you can fix anything. You can redo things and correct even the most disastrous of your mistakes. But remember, there's nothing worse in this world than war, because war renders everything else irrelevant. When there is war, there's neither good nor bad, there's only war. So when they make mockumentaries in the West about Russia mounting offensive and launching missile strikes, there's one thing they fail to understand. The mere mention of war to a Russian makes our skin crawl. It gives us a sense of the world coming to an end, a sense of panic. Once they realize that, if they ever do, they'll be able to understand everything about us. We have lived through real war so many times, not the movies or video games, the way they get to experience it. It's not even the kind of war where they dispatch their troops elsewhere, not knowing what it's like to fight a war at home. If they ever realize that, which I hope they will, they are bound to feel guilty and ashamed of what they're doing right now.
Maria Zakharova, she has tears in her eyes, just so you know. Thank you so much for being in the Now. That does it for us this week. Remember, it's now or never, and I'll see you next week.
Спасибо вам.
Thanks so much.